Where you're standing right now, the station was the Umschlagplatz, or the gathering places from where the Jews of Lodz in the ghetto and the surrounding areas were taken to the various camps that you see scrolled on this monument behind you. This monument is actually really new. It was opened a few years ago by the city, commissioned by the city of Lodz. And it's really kind of an indication of what some of the themes we're going to see during this trip of both Polish and Jewish history and relations. So I want you to think about it this way. You know, many of you have paid attention to what's going on in Europe, particularly in France. And it's about an idea that began in France that lead us to the monument that you see behind us. And this is a 19th century idea that the Jews are not a religion, they're not a people, they are a race, they are a parasite. And ultimately the only solution to deal with this group is extermination. So nothing in history is new. History often repeats itself. And the Nazis implemented a lot of these programs to the point of extermination. The Lodz ghetto was the first major ghetto that was established in Poland, and one of the only ghetto to be liberated in 1944. And pretty much you had the second largest Jewish community in Poland. Lodz, for the most part, is an industrial center. And in our classes, we spoke about the Jewish Council, the Judenrat. You had the head of the Judenrat, Mordechai Romkowski, whose main mission was to keep the people in the ghetto alive as much as possible. And how do you keep the ghetto alive? The rationale is make yourself expendable, not expendable for the Germans. You have a purpose. And because of this, is one of the most controversial and speeches that's given during the wartime, where Romkowski actually stands up and says, "Give me your children. You need to cut a part of the body for the rest of the body to actually survive. Give me your children, give me your elders, that way the rest of us can survive." You have the ghetto is established in 1940, and basically you have anywhere between 165,000 to 200,000 Jews in the ghetto itself, also 5,000 gypsies. And at the end of the war, there's a handful of survivors in the ghetto itself.
The Jewish world begins to shrink. The towns and cities become ghettos. The ghettos become rooms. The rooms become cattle cars, as you see behind you. And the cattle cars become gas chambers. The gas chambers become crematoria. I wish it was a nightmare, but I know personally it wasn't. You see, Lodz, this place is my home. This is where my family comes from. 1939, September 1st, World War II. Everyone thinks the war will end very soon. You see, there was an agreement with England and France. If Poland is invaded, they're going to come and aid us. So the war is short-lived. So what do you think? We've been through bad times before. We had World War I. We had other places. We'll wait it out and see. But when they come in, it's Rosh Hashanah. And they say, okay, synagogues closed, business is open. Turning the world upside down for the Jews already. The leaders of the town are hung. Scaffolding is put up. My father walks through the street and cannot believe it. He's a teenager, just your age. And as he's walking, truck is going through the city and he gets picked up on the truck. along with other guys that happened to be walking in the street, for slave labor, just whatever they needed to be done. And so was my grandfather. He gets picked up, but he doesn't work as fast as the other teens. He's a little older, and he gets beat up so bad. He comes home bleeding from everywhere. And this goes on every day. And it doesn't get better. It starts to get much worse. February 1940, the Lodz ghetto begins. No running water, no heat, 6 to 8 people to a room. People are hungry, they're starving. Rumkowski sets up these factories. If you don't work, you don't eat. So what did you eat? They basically gave you a loaf of bread for a week, 7 days. That was your meat, your food, your main course. Maybe a few rotten vegetables. A lot of people got sick. A lot of people couldn't last. My grandfather, who was beat up so bad, decided he had all these little children at home. So he decided to give up his food and just give it to his wife and the children. And he died, and I actually have a tombstone for him. My mother comes here and she says her and her brother need to run away again temporarily to that border. So she goes, and then she hears terrible rumors. The Germans are planning terrible things. So what are we going to do? She runs back home, takes off her Star of David on her sleeve, and comes back as a Gentile. And she comes back to her parents' house and she says, "You've got to get out of here. The Germans have terrible plans." My grandmother said, "No, the Germans have always been friends with us from World War I. We're used to them. We're just staying." They stayed, unfortunately. But my grandmother came to the station, this station, right here, wearing a shawl. It's Hanukkah. And my mother gets on the train and is ready to go back to Bialystok. And she looks out the window to wave goodbye to her mother. And what she sees is that my grandmother's shawl is covering her Star of David. German walks by, sees that it's covered, pulls out his stick, and starts beating my grandmother and beating her because she had this covered. And the train takes off. And that's the last my mother ever saw of her mother. And the last transport out of the Lodz ghetto is my grandmother and the 2 babies, the 2 little children. Jacob, her 3rd son, says, "I'm not going to let my mother go on the train by herself with the 2 babies." He volunteers, and the 4 of them leave this place for a place unknown to them. They just know they're going to be resettled. The story continues, and another place and another time.